My name is Brian Jablonsky, and I'm talking about Blazor, C# in the browser. I know everybody always asks, "Hey, is there where can I find the slides or the code samples?" I go ahead and give it there. It's github.com/bjablonsky/blazor-pcc 2021. I will post a link to that in the chat before the end of the session. All right, so a little bit about me. My name is Brian Jablonsky. I have about 10 years of professional experience, mostly in the .NET world. I've been an ASP.NET developer for 10 odd years. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm also co-organizer of the New York City .NET Developers User Group. So post-pandemic, if you're in New York City, hit me up or come join us. We'd love you to join our come join our user group. We usually have it on the second Thursdays of the month. You can also follow me on Twitter at Brian_Jablonsky, and you can find all my kind of code and slides and presentations and everything on my GitHub repository, github.com/bjablonsky. All right, so we're talking about Blazor today, and kind of giving an overview of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about getting started with Blazor, how it kind of works, the two different kind of hosting models, Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. We're talking about kind of some usually frequently asked questions that I know have been asked. We're going to talk about what's new in .NET 5, and we're going to give some kind of overviews with Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly, some demos there to show you how everything's done. Then hopefully if we have time, we will look at a quick example of me adding a Blazor component to an existing MVC web app. That's written in ASP.NET MVC. So then at the end, we'll hopefully, if we have any time for questions, I'll be able to do that. But we've got a lot to cover in 55 minutes. So what is Blazor? If you haven't heard by now, Blazor is a .NET web framework that runs in a browser. It basically lets you build interactive web user interfaces using C# instead of JavaScript. It uses kind of C# and Razor and HTML and CSS to be able to author these components. And basically kind of the name of browser plus Razor equals Blazor, and that's where it came from. So you might ask, well, why should I use Blazor? I've been using JavaScript and using other frameworks out there. Why do I want to use Blazor? Well, the nice thing about this is Blazor now enables you to use full stack development using C# and .NET instead of having kind of context switch over to JavaScript. So that's one of the nice things about this. You can basically use from the back end all the way to the front end now, C#. And the other thing is has benefits of the .NET advantages. It's highly performant, it's scalable, it's maintainable, and it's cross-platform. So all the cool kind of .NET features that you have, if you've been using existing .NET, you can now utilize that in kind of your front-end code. The nice thing is you can use Visual Studio or JetBrains Writer or Visual Studio Code even if you want to go ahead and develop your app. The nice thing is it can leverage the existing .NET ecosystem with .NET libraries to be able to kind of shoehorn that in. Now, obviously, if things are geared towards .NET Framework, you'll have to make sure that they're compatible with .NET Core to be able to kind of put them in a WebAssembly type framework. But we'll discuss a little bit of that a little bit later. The other nice thing is that you can share application logic across the server and client. You don't have to really kind of rewrite a lot of it, or a lot of times you have to write a model in JavaScript or TypeScript, and then you have to write a model in C#, and you have to kind of whenever you do an update in one place, you got to make sure you update the other place. So what's nice about this is you can have a shared project and kind of share that application logic throughout the server and the client side. And the nice thing is they kind of give you two user interface rendering options. One is the server side, which is called Blazor Server. And that's kind of what you're used to is traditional MVC and web forms. The server goes ahead and renders the HTML and passes that on to the web browser. And then there's now a kind of client-side rendering UI, which is called Blazor WebAssembly. And that's actually offloads all of the work of rendering the UI onto the browser, just like you would with JavaScript and all of your DOM manipulation. So you can actually use C# to be able to do all of your kind of client-side rendering with the UI. So that's kind of nice. So you might say, okay, cool. You hooked me. Now what do I do what I need to get set up? Well, one thing is you need a WebAssembly compatible browser. Now all the major browsers out there are now WebAssembly compatible. That's Safari, Chrome, Edge, Firefox. One of the things I will not say is that Internet Explorer is not, and maybe some other web browsers out there might not be compatible with WebAssembly. You can go to that link and go ahead and kind of check about the WebAssembly status in each of the browsers that you want to use. Now, obviously, you have to use the current version of Firefox, current version of Chrome. So if you're on older versions, one, you should probably upgrade because of security concerns. Two, you'll get some great benefits with WebAssembly. The other thing is you need a .NET Core SDK. Now, since .NET 5 was released back in November, yay, I'm going to talk about .NET 5 rather than talking about .NET Core 3.0. And on top of that, you kind of need an IDE if you want kind of a full-fledged experience. You can either use JetBrains Rider 2020.2 version, Visual Studio 2019, or Visual Studio Code. If you don't want to use kind of a heavyweight IDE, if you just want to use Visual Studio Code, you can definitely use that to be able to develop things. You're going to get a lot more powerful features with Visual Studio 2019 and Rider 2020.2, but you can definitely use Visual Studio Code if you want to. So let's talk about kind of how Blazor works. At the core of it, there's kind of two things. One is there's a Blazor hosting model, and that was very similar to what I was talking about there's a WebAssembly side, which is the client side, and the server side, which is the kind of server-side rendering of the UI. So those are your two hosting models. And then there is something called a component. And this is kind of like a web component like you normally do with Angular or React or any other type of JavaScript framework. Is, they have this idea of a component that kind of encapsulates logic and UI and all that into kind of one little thing. You can kind of plug these components into your web application. So you basically create these things called Razor components or Blazor components. So components are a fundamental building block of web apps. Again, they're using React, and this concept is used in React and Angular and Vue and elsewhere in the web world. So they're basically self-contained UI. They include HTML and logic to be able to inject data or to respond to events. They can be kind of nested and reused and shared between projects, which is kind of nice. You kind of write this component once and be able to share it across all of your different projects if you need to. The nice thing about this is all these components are now written in C# and Razor, HTML and CSS, instead of using JavaScript. So you don't have to do that kind of context switching back and forth between C# and Razor if you're doing MVC, and then having to do maybe some JavaScript front end stuff, maybe with jQuery, or using React or Angular or TypeScript and stuff like that. So you don't have to worry about that whole kind of context switching. I love .NET. I love C#. That's what I'm most comfortable with. I grew up in the time, or I learned JavaScript in the time pre-ECMAScript 5, and so JavaScript kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. I know it's come a long way, but this got me really excited because I don't have to go ahead and learn a whole nother kind of framework for JavaScript if I want to learn Angular or React or Vue or any of these other, kind of component frameworks, JavaScript component frameworks out there. I can use everything I traditionally learned with C# and Razor and my MVC .NET framework apps. I can go ahead and kind of reuse a lot of that knowledge that I've already gained. So that's kind of nice. So I said there's kind of two hosting models, Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. We're going to get into Blazor Server first, because that's kind of the easiest one to kind of understand. It basically decouples the rendering logic from how the UI updates are applied. And what does this mean? And I'm going to kind of show you an example. It basically says that the UI is kind of rendered on a server and then passed back and then went ahead and kind of added or shown on the web browser front end. And basically how, traditionally how you look at kind of web forms or MVC, you'd use kind of an HTTP life cycle of a get, a post, or whatever to be able to get a response and request to be able to get your data back in your HTML that you need to do. Occasionally, you would start to use AJAX and stuff for asynchronous web requests. Well, one thing is now you're going to use something called SignalR, which is a WebSocket to be able to kind of do that. So WebSockets at the basic core of it, it's kind of a lightweight communication protocol to be able to connect back to the server and kind of do some small binary back and forth. And so you now don't have the kind of big overhead of HTTP requests and all this other stuff that you have to deal with. It's a very kind of lightweight, you can start to get, down into a GPRC is another type of communication protocol that's even kind of smaller than WebSocket. So that's kind of nice. But Blazor Server primarily uses SignalR, which is Microsoft's version of their kind of WebSocket technology. And this was released in .NET Core, which was released back in 2019. That was September, I believe, of 2019, released in the .NET Core 3.0 release. So kind of how traditional, server-side rendering would happen. You have a server that kind of rendered stuff, push it over HTTP to your web browser. You maybe have a web worker there to be able to grab the updates and apply the updates. But the problem is you kind of have this HTTP, and that's kind of a little bit heavyweight. You got to, there's tons of, headers and all kinds of other information that's kind of heavy. We started way back in the day with SOAP and XML, and trimmed it down to JSON now. So now we're going to trim it down a little bit better to get a little bit better performance. And so basically, Blazor Server works very similar. So Blazor is kind of hosted in ASP.NET Core and the server side, and that's where all the kind of UI rendering will happen. And then it kind of pushes everything over the wire via Signal R, which is that WebSocket, to the browser, and then the web browser, web worker is responsible for kind of taking that and applying the UI updates through the document manipulations and stuff like that. Now, I will back up and say that this is not 100% completely free of JavaScript at all. There is JavaScript, but that is all written for you by the framework, by Blazor, by Microsoft to abstract that away. You don't actually have to touch any of that. Yes, you will have to load up a few JavaScript files, but again, don't have to touch it, don't have to code in it. So you should be good there. So let's kind of dive right in and kind of see what a Blazor server application looks like. So I'm going to switch over to my code, and let's make sure I got the right one. Yep, this is Blazor server. So if you want to, let's just take you through file, new project. When you're creating new projects, go here, ASP.NET Core web application. You can see down here, here's the Blazor app. So you can click on that and click next. Go ahead and fill everything that you need to out. And then you have a couple of options. Give it a second to create the project here. And now you're kind of presented with your framework, whether you want, what version of .NET Core you want, whether you want 3. I only have 3 and 3.1 and .NET 5 on my machine. But actually, that's the only ones that are going to work, was 3, 3.1, and 5. You have the two options of whether you want to create a Blazor server app or Blazor WebAssembly app. You can go ahead and add authentication if you want, enable Docker support, and go ahead and create this. But we will cancel all that because we don't need to necessarily do that. I already have an example. Oh, well, I did have an example loaded up. So let's open up our project for Blazor server. And so this is a very, basic Blazor template. This is the same kind of Blazor template they give you out of the box. The only small little caveat I did is that let's just run this real quick. The only small caveat I did is I basically took a component that was included out of the box in this template and moved it into its own project. And so I can show how I can share, this is part of the being able to reshare these components across multiple different projects. So, if you do a .NET New, this is what you're going to see. You're going to see a home, a counter, and a fetch data. And so this actually Blazor counter component, I went ahead and made it own project. I read Blazor components.shared, and I basically just moved this Blazor component all the way over to a shared components project. So I can share it in multiple different places if I wanted to, just to kind of show you that you can, how you want to enable you to build all these applications. So again, this is just copy and pasted straight from the original solution. And let's actually look at it. So if I go over to here, let's hit F12, and let's get our network, and let's go ahead and reload this. You can go ahead and see that it goes ahead and loads a bunch of things up. And you can see down here, this is where the actual WebSocket is being loaded up. And so what this is actually responsible for is this is responsible for that Signal R communication back and forth to the server. So that anytime there's a UI event, it can push a message to the server can handle it, render the UI, push that back to the client so that the client can render it. So let's go ahead, and we have this this is their Blazor server. We're going to put a breakpoint right here on our current count. So we're going to go back to our web browser. You can see here. Move this down so we can kind of see everything on one screen. I'm going to click on the counter. You can see there's binary messages being sent back and forth. For the sake of it, we'll clear everything, and then I'm going to click the click me. And you can see what happens is I now have broken back to the server. Here's my breakpoint where I'm hitting, where the current count. I can go ahead and see what the count is. It's 0. We're going to increment that, and we can go ahead and say continue. And if you want to look over here, you can see nothing's really happened over here because we haven't had that message back from the server. So go ahead and click continue. And you can see we have all messages of everything that's being passed back and forth between the server and the client. You can see now we've gone ahead and incremented to current count of 1. So, we'll go ahead and take that breakpoint out, and you can see it's basically going back and forth to the server, incrementing and displaying it. So, relatively straightforward demo, and so that's kind of good for basically everything out of the box that you will need. So now let's talk about a different hosting model, the Blazor WebAssembly. And so Blazor WebAssembly is very similar to the Blazor server model, except for the fact that instead of hosting the rendering on the server, we're going to host the render on the browser. This is where things get really kind of interesting. Basically, we'll host the Blazor components in a browser using a WebAssembly-based .NET runtime. So this is your true single-page application. It utilizes client resources to be able to do the rendering, logic, and all that stuff on the client browser. And this is what you traditionally use your JavaScript SPAs for, and being able to manipulate and create those interactive websites. And one nice thing about Blazor WebAssembly is it supports offline capability. It supports static sites. You don't need to necessarily host this on MVC. You can create a static site and host it in Azure Static Sites. I know there was another talk earlier today about Azure Static Sites. So you can create a Blazor WebAssembly single-page application and host it there. You can also, if you want to, host it on Node.js, on Ruby, on any kind of, whatever web stack you want to go ahead and run it. So this is kind of another front end you can end up using. It also supports progressive web apps as well. So if you want to kind of install this application as a kind of standalone application in either your mobile browser or your desktop, you can kind of have that kind of progressive web app feeling. This was released in .NET Core 3.1.3. That was released in May of 2020. 2020, so long ago. It's now 2021. Can't believe it. So it was released outside of the normal kind of .NET Core release cycle, because .NET Core is kind of being released every once a year in the kind of September, October timeframe in November. But this was released kind of off cycle during build 2020 because it needed to do some additional tweaking and stuff like that. A lot of what Blazor WebAssembly does is actually dependent on another group that does some of the WebAssembly stuff underneath. So they were waiting for some tweaks and bits and stuff there to be able to fully get everything done before they release that. So they released that, and that's now available in .NET Core 3.1.3. So if you want to use Blazor WebAssembly, you definitely have to have that as your kind of bare minimum. You can't use ASP.NET Core 3.0. So that's something to remember. So how does this kind of work? So Blazor WebAssembly is kind of the client-side rendering. So basically everything kind of happens in the browser. You load up all of your assemblies, you load up your runtime, you load up your code, and everything's run in the browser. So there's no kind of server component to it. Obviously, if you need to fetch any kind of APIs or data stuff, you can definitely call it out to, either ASP.NET or whatever you want to, Java or whatever you want to go ahead and call a web server to be able to get some data if you want to. So let's take a step back here and let's talk about WebAssembly, because you're like, okay, this sounds awesome, but what is WebAssembly? I've never heard of this before. So I want to give a kind of quick crash course in WebAssembly. This is not going to go deep. This is very much 10,000 foot view level. So basically, WebAssembly is a binary instruction format for a stack-based virtual machine. What does that mean? That's basically the same thing as what JavaScript is. JavaScript is a stack-based virtual machine that runs in your browser. WebAssembly is now a different type of stack-based virtual machine that can run in your browser. And this is basically a new type of code that can be run in your browser. And then the whole reason why they kind of developed this is because they notice a lot of time when you're doing mathematically intensive computations in JavaScript, some things JavaScript doesn't excel at. One, mathematical computations, trying to do 3D rendering and, and doing 3D, calculations and stuff like that, doesn't really excel well at that. So what's nice about WebAssembly is that it kind of provides near native speed. And so, they have kind of three big goals here. One is kind of fast, efficient, and portable code. So it can be the WASM code, WebAssembly code, can be executed at near native speed in the browser. The other thing is it can be readable and debuggable. So it's a low-level assembly language, but is in human-readable text format. Now, I will say, caveat here, don't try to write this yourself. I mean, you can if you want to, but you're going to waste a lot of time. You basically, WebAssembly was meant to be a compiler target, a transpiling target. So you take your C, C++, C#, Ruby, whatever other language, and transpile it into WebAssembly to be able to now run it on the browser. It's also meant to be secure. So the whole thing of JavaScript was meant to be designed in this kind of safe sandbox execution environment, just like JavaScript is today in the browser. So with those kind of three goals, they kind of end up having two sets of parts to the WebAssembly. One is that virtual stack-based virtual machine to actually run the code. And then the thing is WebAssembly right now currently doesn't support doing any kind of DOM manipulations to the web browser. So it basically will have a set of APIs that will call out to JavaScript and to be able to manipulate the DOM or have JavaScript respond to events. When you click on a button, fire things up and pass it through to WebAssembly for them to be able to run the code on a virtual machine. So traditionally, the browsers don't have had one VM, that's JavaScript. So now we added an additional VM that hopefully has near native speeds that can kind of fix some of the pitfalls that JavaScript has. So out of that, we end up coming with Blazor. So the nice thing is you can see that WebAssembly is not meant to kind of replace JavaScript. It's meant to augment it. So you might say, well, hey, we already have JavaScript. We're already writing JavaScript applications. Yeah, that's completely fine. It's not meant to completely replace it. Just another tool in your tool belt. So, and like I said, it's meant to be kind of a compilation target of source languages, and it can't access that DOM directly. It has to use this kind of JavaScript glue code to be able to manipulate the DOM. So let's talk about how actually Blazor WebAssembly works in the course of everything. So now I understand how the WebAssembly portion of it works. How does Blazor WebAssembly works? So at the core of it, it's basically C# files are compiled into .NET assemblies. Nothing different than your current what you're used to with web forms and MVC and everything like that. You can see here's a blazor.wasm.client.dll. Everything's compiled into a DLL. The next thing is that there's a whole bunch of assemblies and .NET runtime that help you assist run your actual DLL, your Blazor WASM client runtime in the browser. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff that's included for you when you go ahead and build, in .NET 5. You can see here's a whole bunch of things. This is .NET JavaScript, which is responsible for kind of doing the JavaScript interop between WebAssembly and the DOM, and goes ahead and loads up some additional things like the WebAssembly to be able to load up the Blazor WebAssembly to be able to run the .NET runtime. So you can see the Blazor WebAssembly page is very simple. It's very, if you've done kind of React or if you've done Angular, this is very similar. You have a kind of loading div tag down here, and then kind of go ahead and fire off a service worker to go ahead and register things and load things up. And so you can see this is the index.html page, and this is responsible for going ahead and running through and loading everything up that it needs to. So you can see now if we kind of look at the network stack, in a Chrome-based browser of how everything loads up, you can see basically these are, this red line donates basically what those 4 files or what ends up being loaded up through that web page. So if we go back slightly, you can see that all of these files being loaded up here, that's basically these files here. And then what ends up happening is this Blazor WebAssembly.js file is responsible for going ahead and loading up the .NET runtime and going ahead and loading up your .NET WASM and loading up the rest of your DLLs and everything to be able to load everything up. And then, using that kind of interoperability that's built into WebAssembly is Blazor uses kind of DOM manipulation and browser API calls from the .NET runtime using this JavaScript interoperability. So Whenever any kind of C# code gets run, it pushes a render tree over to the Blazor JavaScript, which then, if it needs to, goes ahead and changes the DOM. Or if there's a event triggered on the DOM, like you click a button, that Blazor JavaScript will go ahead and push over to the C# runtime and go ahead and tell it all the data it needs to process that event. What's nice about this is it doesn't press, or pass back an entire new DOM. It only gives you those kind of UI changes, or the UI differences. So you're not basically updating the entire thing. You're only updating snippets of things that you need to do. So that's kind of a little bit more efficient. So passes back some of the UI differences to the JavaScript, and then JavaScript's responsible for going ahead and manipulating the DOM and changing everything that needs to. So let's get into it. We kind of gave you a crash course. Let's look at kind of WebAssembly here. So we will close our server, Blazor server example, and hopefully that'll give me a little bit more resources because I'm running 3 copies of Visual Studio. So as you can see, this is, if I said file new, go ahead and create the client-side WebAssembly version of Blazor. This is kind of how everything comes out of the box. The only difference here is, again, I took that kind of counter Blazor logic that would come out of the box and put it in its own shared component. So again, this is the same shared component that was Blazor server that I can now use with Blazor WebAssembly. So this is great. So if you're kind of going ahead and you don't want to use Blazor WebAssembly right away, but you're using Blazor server, you can go ahead and create all of your components using Blazor server, and then eventually shift over to Blazor WebAssembly, doing very little kind of updating and reworking of your code and logic. So let's go ahead and fire this up. And fingers crossed, hope that everything is working. Now I'm running this in Edge Canary, just to show that you can run it in Edge as well as Chrome. Give a couple minutes to fire up. My laptop's a little slow. I've got a lot of things running. You can see right here, you can see that kind of loading web page. That's where it's going ahead and grabbing all the DLLs it needs to, all the WebAssembly framework and JavaScript and your .NET DLL entities and everything, loading all that up. So you kind of see that. There's ways around that in .NET 5 that makes things look a little bit faster, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But here at the very core of things, let's fire up, debugging. Let's go ahead and empty cache and a hard reload. And you'll see, as you can see, we're loading up. Here's the JavaScript. This ends up going ahead and firing off additional things to be able to load everything up. And you can see, here we go. Now, here's one of the cool things is we can go ahead and say, let's take that breakpoint off first. So, this works like you'd expect, but you notice we're connected to the web server. Let's actually go offline. Now we're offline, so we can actually click this and things still work. We can still navigate around. Things don't break. This is all running on your client side. Now, obviously, if we go to fetch data, what's going to happen is we can't fetch data because we have no connection to the server. This fetch data actually goes to a web service to be able to fetch some data to be able to show it. So you'll get that. So one of the cool things is, let's go ahead and bring us back online, is that hopefully, if everything's working out, I can put a breakpoint there. And let me rerun this one more time. Give it a second to load up. And one thing I'm doing is I'm going to do, to enable debugging on your Edge or your Chrome-based browsers, you got to hit Shift-Alt-D to bring up the debugger. Hopefully I have everything set up. Oh, I do not have everything set up. So let's try. Let's run this from here. So hopefully, if I rerun this, hopefully everything will work. things a little bit broken on my machine. I was trying to fix all this before the session, because I have preview versions and stuff like that installed. So let's hope everything works. Nah. Well, I'm going to have to fix that and figure that out. So I apologize for that. But trust me when I say that you can, when you click that, what can actually end up happening is you can actually do a breakpoint back into your server code. And so you can go ahead and do debugging. Previously, you would have to kind of fire things up and debug it inside the actual dev tools, and being able to do everything was kind of a pain in the butt. But now you can actually kind of do that full debugging experience using Visual Studio. All right, cool. So we kind of showed you what WebAssembly, Blazor WebAssembly looks like. Now let's kind of talk about which you'd use, Blazor WebAssembly or Blazor Server. So there's kind of trade-offs. So one of the things is Blazor WebAssembly, you're loading up an entire .NET runtime, you're loading up DLLs, you're loading up, the WebAssembly code and JavaScript. And so that's actually going to be a larger download size. And I'll talk about this later about what's the actual size of that. But there is a kind of initial hit. You'll see, when you were kind of loading up, you could see that it was loading. And as it fetched all the assets it needs to, it ended up rendering it. So that's kind of one thing. If you want something super fast and super efficient, you want to probably use Blazor Server, because that'll be a much smaller download size. Everything kind of sets up with a Signal or WebSocket. And all of your kind of rendering UI logic and code and everything's sitting on the server, not on your browser. You don't have to download all that. Now, one caveat here is that if you're using kind of a CDN, that kind of .NET WebAssembly, once you load it once, you should be cached in your browser and be able to reuse it on multiple different sites. So kind of see if that's fine for you, if you can cache it once and if that's going to be acceptable to you. Otherwise, if you really want the smallest download size possible, look at Blazor Server. The other thing is kind of load time. So Blazor Server has a super fast load time. It's a couple of assets get loaded up really fast, and then it's your server kind of going ahead and doing the rendering. So you have that basically instantaneous feel. And if you saw on the Blazor WebAssembly side, again, because it has to download these files and load everything up, there's a bit of a slower load time. You can actually do some tweaking there with you actually kind of do a hybrid model where you use Blazor WebAssembly, but you use what they call kind of pre-rendering on the server side to be able to give you the HTML and then kind of let everything load up in the background and then continue on and kind of hot refresh that to the Blazor WebAssembly. So you can definitely do that. So again, that's kind of trade-offs. You gotta figure out what's good for your application or not. And the other thing is Blazor WebAssembly is all the code is running in the client. So realize that if I hit, if somebody hits F12, they're going to see all your code. So if you need to hide your code, go ahead and run it on Blazor Server, because that code never leaves the server. It only goes ahead and there's updates that go ahead and kind of UI differences that get sent over the wire through Signal R to the Blazor Server to be able to do all that. And all your code gets executed on the server and it kind of never leaves it. So obviously there's ways around that with authentication, which you currently do with a SPA framework today. So don't think it's necessary that you can't run WebAssembly with any kind of authentication, but just know that your code is out there so anybody can kind of pick and choose it. So if you have some super proprietary code that you don't want to run, you may want to look at Blazor Server instead. Blazor WebAssembly has lower latency because everything's kind of rendered on the browser and there's no kind of network traffic to be able to get the updates for the UI. You're going to have lower latency, so things are going to be much faster and appear much faster once after that kind of initial load is done. Blazor Server, you have a little bit of higher latency as you're kind of going to the server, getting the UI to be rendered and getting that back and rendering it on your client side. So there's kind of that, milliseconds of latency going to the server in that round trip. Now, it's not that bad, but if something, if you're deploying an application out to somebody in the field that has very bad, 3G coverage and can barely, load a web page, you might think, well, okay, Blazor WebAssembly might be a better candidate for that rather than Blazor Server because of the fact that there's a lot of latency over kind of, mobile internet. The other thing is Blazor Server does not support offline capabilities. So as soon as you lose that connectivity, your app is broke. So Blazor WebAssembly, it supports fully offline, supports going ahead and doing progressive web apps and being able to cache any kind of data that needs to with progressive web apps, and being able to do everything that you want to on the app itself, and kind of make it more less dependent on network traffic. So, okay, if you need to upload something, obviously can't upload something, it can queue it up, and eventually, as soon as it gets online, it can go ahead and send that data it needs to the server. But for the most part, the client can continue to interact with the application as long as there's no data that needs to be sent over. Blazor WebAssembly, one of the things is it consumes fewer server resources. Again, all the logic is kind of done on the client side. So all you need to do is just push all the data over, throw all of your static files up into a cloud, a CDN, and go ahead and deliver that over to the client, and the client can go ahead and run it. The kind of trade-off here is that Blazor server requires more server resources because, again, it's rendering things. Now, I will show a kind of an article that was written by Microsoft about what kind of performance aspects you can see with Blazor server, and it's actually relatively good. So, having to push everything off over to the client-side UI versus having everything rendered on your server-side UI doesn't necessarily, it's not that bad of a trade-off, but something to consider, if you're doing a big Black Friday website where you're going to have tons of traffic, something to consider. The other thing is WebAssembly. Blazor WebAssembly requires a WebAssembly compatible browser. So if you're using IE or some type of other browser, maybe an older version of Chrome or Safari or Firefox, it doesn't support WebAssembly, you might not, you can't use Blazor WebAssembly. There are some kind of tricks and hacks in there to kind of do polyfilling and stuff like that, but for the most part, it requires a WebAssembly compatible browser for the easiest use. Blazor server doesn't, so that's one thing to think of if you're in the legacy environment. You need to, support clients that don't have a WebAssembly compatible browser. Definitely think about that. So cool. Some of the frequently asked questions I usually hear is, does Blazor WebAssembly compile my entire .NET assembly into WebAssembly? Yes and no, kind of. So no, there might be some support later on. Right now they're targeting .NET 6 with this, that do kind of static ahead of time compilation into WebAssembly, so you don't have that kind of overhead of having to run the WebAssembly, the .NET WebAssembly, the runtime, and then your application on top of that, and so that there's kind of tons of abstraction layers there. There's just room for improvement of execution there. But as of right now, no, it doesn't compile in the entire .NET assembly into WebAssembly. It's already pre-compiled and given to you so that you can go ahead and deploy that out. And basically, only the .NET runtime is actually compiled into WebAssembly. Your code that you generate is still DLL, still your CLR code that will run on the .NET framework. So your actual code doesn't get compiled down into WebAssembly. So you might think, okay, well, if I'm downloading the .NET runtime, won't that be huge? I'm running a .NET runtime in the browser. It's good. I'm going to have to download hundreds of megabytes, right? Or 50 or 100 megabytes. Actually, no, not really. So the .NET WASM file is about 2.7 megs, 1.1 when it's kind of gzipped and compressed. Typically, from a base project template, you're going to look about 8.5 megs of typical resources that are going to kind of be downloaded. They did some improvements with .NET 5 with additional kind of tree shaking to kind of reduce the size. So if you don't need certain aspects of the .NET runtime, you don't necessarily need, it won't include it. It won't include any of the DLLs that you need. Also, you can be compressed down into the reduce the size. And additionally, it can be lazy loaded. So that initial call, it doesn't have to load up everything that you need. It can load up the initial application, then call and load just in time as needed the additional components of your application, so you don't have that huge size right all at once. So the other question is, can I use Blazor WebAssembly without a .NET backend? So yes, you can use Blazor WebAssembly. It can be used with any backend or not. You can use it with a static site like Azure Static Web Apps or CDN or something like that. You can use it with Node, anything like that. Blazor Server, however, requires ASP.NET Core. Again, because all that UI logic is baked into ASP.NET Core. So finally getting to my question of what's the performance of Blazor server, because you said, yeah, you're offloading all of the UI rendering onto Blazor server. That's, it's probably a huge load. So the dev blogs over at Microsoft went ahead and did some kind of performance testing and scenarios. And I noticed that a VM with 1 CPU and 3.5 gigs of RAM handled over 5,000 concurrent users. And basically the main kind of bottleneck of all of it is the server's memory. So you can also use Azure Signal R service to quickly and easily scale out as you need to. So, Blazor server today, it's good enough to go out there. I mean, unless you're doing the most demanding websites out there, I would say Blazor server is okay to use. Blazor server is a little bit more mature than the WebAssembly version. WebAssembly still needs some fixes here and there for some performance gains, but we're getting better every day at it. Hopefully .NET 6 will be another big milestone for that. But Blazor server today, it's great. It can go ahead and handle your applications. Again, make sure that you're okay with some of the limitations of having to be connected up to the server and not being able to be interrupted with a network connection, because that will end up breaking your Blazor server app. But something to think about, if you're traditionally serving up MVC apps or web forms or something like that, you're kind of used to this. So you actually see much better performance out of Blazor server than you would probably with your traditional MVC apps, just because of the way things are kind of optimized and things are handled. So awesome. What's new in .NET 5? .NET 5 just came out in November of this year November of last year in 2020. And so what came new out of .NET 5 as far as Blazor is concerned? So one of the things is the Blazor WebAssembly performance was improved about 2 to 3 times over. And that's huge, because there's a lot of small things where as you're loading things up, it was taking longer, things were taking longer to load. When you're comparing a Blazor WebAssembly application to a JavaScript application, the JavaScript application was a little bit more performant. So they've done a lot of optimizations there. They've also done some kind of pre-rendering and lazy loading to kind of help masquerade some performance issues. So it looks and feels like it's a very performant issue. So it's great. The other thing is they had JavaScript and CSS isolation. So you can isolate the JavaScript and CSS inside of your components so that it doesn't leak out in other your CSS and JavaScript doesn't affect any other components. So that's kind of nice. They also add some component virtualization. So that's part of the kind of performance of being able to render things off screen if it needs to, and then being able to, like if you have a list of 10,000 items, only rendering what you need to in the screen and having things kind of render as they need to as you're moving up. So you're not rendering the entire 10,000 list. You're only kind of rendering what's in your viewport of your browser. The other thing is debugging of Blazor WebAssembly is now supported directly in Visual Studio. So you'll be able to go ahead and debug everything before you kind of had to debug it in using Chrome web developer tools. And you didn't have the nice IDE. Unfortunately, my step was slightly broken today. So I had another talk that I had to do. So things weren't exactly set up all that I needed to. So there might be something wrong with my configuration. So I apologize for that. I can show it, but it basically does support that real-time debugging of going back to Visual Studio and debugging, having all those great tools there at your disposal. Finally, Blazor WebAssembly, part of their kind of performance improvements, enables pre-rendering and lazy loading. So one of the things, you don't have to load all of your DLLs in WebAssembly. You can kind of lazy load things as you need to, grab all the resources as you kind of need to be able to render them. The other thing is that kind of pre-rendering environment you saw where when I first loaded up the Blazor WebAssembly app, you saw that loading part. Well, you can actually go ahead and use Blazor Server to kind of do a pre-render of your HTML page, serve that up, and then in the background, it goes ahead and loads everything up and continues on. So basically, it's the best of both worlds. And in general, you have all the .NET general performance improvements. If you looked at web benchmarks out there, .NET 5 is blowing. I thought for sure with .NET 3, how can you improve further on .NET Core 3? They've now done even more general improvements of ASP.NET 5 with just general performance improvements out there. So you get all that built in addition to what all the performance improvements they've done with WebAssembly and Blazor in general. So cool. I'll do this demo of adding Blazor to an existing MVC app but in sake of time, I know I have about 10 minutes left. Is there any kind of questions before I go ahead and do that demo? Let me see on chat. Okay, nope. I don't see anybody raise their hands. I don't see anybody in chat. Okay, cool. You would jump over, so I will go ahead and close this out. Stop debugging. So here's a traditional MVC application. Let's go ahead and run this. This is part of .NET 5. Give it a second to load up. And there you go. That's kind of the template out of the box. Added in this kind of counter here. There's nothing kind of there. But that's where we're going to add that kind of counter shared component that we created in our other projects that we can go ahead and use inside this MVC app. So as you can see, let's go ahead and stop this. So as you can see, this is an MVC app. You got your controllers, your models, your views. I added this additional view here. As you can see right now, the only thing it just shows the updates the title to counter. There's nothing in here. This is just commented out code that I have here. And then obviously in the layout page, I added the nav link to the counter. So that's really kind of the only two things I did that wasn't really traditionally already done for you out of the box with an MVC app. Then with the solution, I added in my Blazor components shared. So this is that Blazor components that you saw in the Blazor WebAssembly version and the Blazor server version. So this is that kind of Blazor component that I've built, or that I copied straight from the template and dumped into its own Blazor component that I can end up reusing now. So in order to, we're going to use MVC web apps, we're going to use this MVC app, and we're going to use Blazor server to be able to do some of the rendering and adding in the components here. You can also do this with WebAssembly. I'm just choosing to do server because server is a little bit easier in the sake of time, because I know I only have a couple minutes. So one quick thing is when you go to your startup.cs, really all you have to add in is a couple things. One right here into your configure services, we're basically going to add server-side Blazor support. So as you can see, we already had controls with views. We're now adding server-side Blazor. And then in our configure method, down here, we have our endpoints of using the traditional mapper controller route. And then now we're going to add in, the Blazor hub, which is the Blazor signal R, to be able to do that kind of communication. So we'll add that. And then we'll go over to our counter view, and we'll go ahead and uncomment this out. And so really the only real difference is that we include this additional section of scripts to be able to host the Blazor server JavaScript that is able to fire up the Signal R WebSocket to be able to communicate and open up that WebSocket back to the server to be able to do all that stuff. So we added that script in, and then we added in our component. This is very similar to how you would do with traditional Blazor server or Blazor WebAssembly. You'd add a component. The only thing is we're saying this render mode will be on a server. There's different render modes you can actually use. And so we're basically using the type of Blazor component shared counter. And that's it. So let's fire it back up and let it build. My computer really wants to be slow today. There we go. It's loading everything up. So now if we go back over to this counter page, we should see our component rendered, and we do. So here's our Blazor component. And when I click it, you can see it goes ahead and responds. Now we can actually go back over here, and we should be able to set a breakpoint in the Blazor component that we have, the counter component. Every time it increments, I want to see that, every time a button's clicked, it increments the counter. And so I want to see that. So let's go ahead and click it. And now you see we now have broken into our debug code of being able to debug this. We go ahead and continue. And you see it's now incremented. So let's take this debugging point out. And so there you go. So now that's a really great thing. So you're like, okay, so how, I'm set with Blazor. I want to use Blazor, but I have traditional MVC apps. I have Razor Page apps. I have, whatever, any kind of ASP.NET Core apps. I would like to eventually use Blazor, but I don't want to have to rewrite my entire application from the ground up. Well, the nice thing about this is you use your traditional MVC app and slowly replace things with components. As you need to do some feature updates to things, as you need to add new features to your web app, you can go ahead and use Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly if you want with your traditional MVC app. And as long as you're running on .NET Core, that's one caveat. You can't run this on .NET Framework. That you can go ahead and use Razor and build out these Razor components. And once you've kind of componentized everything in your entire MVC web app, now you can move over to Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly relatively easy because you have all the components for all of your logic that you need to do. And you just kind of redo the shell of the website. So I think that's super, super awesome. And you can kind of iterate over this. So you don't have to do a cut and redo all your work all in one kind of fell swoop. So that to me is kind of hugely exciting that I can kind of incrementally build this out. Once the app is there, we can kind of shift over to Blazor as we want to. So some additional information. Obviously, there's the my GitHub for the slide and demos. You can also download the Rider 2020.2 and Visual Studio 2019. You can go to blazor.net for some additional, that's all of your Microsoft Docs Blazor Microsoft resource for all the documentation for Blazor. There's also this cool website called Awesome Blazor. It's kind of a community project that shows you all the kind of cool things that people have done with Blazor. So I definitely recommend that as you're trying to go along figuring out, hey, how to use this component? How do I integrate with the SQL Server? How do I integrate with authentication? How do I integrate with whatever? You'll probably find a good example out there so that you can basically look at the code and be able to replicate that in your environment. And then here's that link to the DevBlogs, Microsoft DevBlogs post about the performance snares. I'm interested to see what the kind of performance is in .NET 5 because this was done for .NET Core 3. So switching back, let's look at the. So here's can I use WebAssembly? This will tell you basically all the browsers that are supported with WebAssembly if you want to look at that. Obviously, if you want to download .NET 5. And if you go to blazor.net, this is the Blazor documentation. There's tons of things you can download, get your .NET runtime, go ahead and get started with all the Blazor documentation. Here's that awesome Blazor, and you can see they have tons of events happening and all kinds of articles and demos and sample projects. This gets updated all the time. So if you're interested in learning more about Blazor, here's tons of examples and stuff to really start to dive into and really get comfortable with it. And then here's that DevBlogs article about .NET 3 or Blazor Server and .NET Core 3.0. Cool, and that's it for me. Anybody else have any questions? I know I kind of went through a lot. It's a lot to kind of take in and to kind of go through in 55 minutes, but hopefully I gave you an overview and you can now start jumping into it.
Are you using this a lot with clients?
No, unfortunately not. A lot of my clients are, we've had traditional JavaScript applications that we've used. In my current job, we are actually, there's some talk about using Blazor for like a dashboard type utility. We have a lot of services that we use, and so trying to aggregate all those logs up and being able to use Blazor. So there's talks about using that. I know many people I've talked to throughout the community that a lot of companies are now adopting Blazor, especially Blazor Server. So there's people definitely out there adopting this, and so it's not.
I have an internal app that the client I work for that's used by dozens to 100 people. It's very fast, and it's used for showing a lot of data that's in the content management systems.
Yeah.
Sort of a look behind the scenes, and then I use Telerik controls for that, and then it reads from dozens and dozens of databases, and people can extract and create their own spreadsheets. So they stopped sending me emails saying, will you do a report for me?
Exactly. Yeah. And so part of what we have a bunch of Windows services that we're running on a Windows box. So we're able to do some parsing and stuff like that. And so one of the things is you always have to log in. You have to RDP into the server and look at the logs and restart the service and stuff like that. So I'm actually trying to create a dashboard so that, their kind of production support people can just say, there was an error, something crashed out. Let's restart it. Let's grab some logs and create a support ticket so that we can go ahead and look into it and figure out what's all wrong, attach things and do all that kind of stuff. So we're kind of really excited to build that out with using Blazor. So